Stop drinking your coffee the way you have for the last 40 years, because the way you were taught to drink it might be quietly working against your blood sugar, and nobody ever sat you down and told you the truth. I'm going to say something that's going to sound backwards. If you're over 60 and you've been told that coffee is bad for you, that it spikes your blood sugar, that you should switch to decaf or cut it out entirely because you're pre diabetic or managing type 2 diabetes, I want you to actually stop believing that today, because the real research, and I mean the big, serious, published research, tells a very different story. A massive analysis pooling more than 1 million people across 28 separate studies found that people who drank the most coffee had up to a 30% lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes compared to people who drank little or none. 30%. That is not a rounding error. That is one of the largest dietary associations ever recorded for a chronic disease. And it holds up whether the coffee was caffeinated or decaffeinated. So before you throw out your coffee maker because someone on the internet told you to, I want you to hear me out, because what I'm about to share isn't about whether to drink coffee. It's about how, when, and with what, because those details are the difference between coffee working for your blood sugar and coffee working against it. Now, before we dive in, I want to know who's watching this, because I read every single comment on these videos myself. So down in the comments, tell me your age and tell me this. Do you drink your coffee black, or do you take it with cream, sugar, milk, or one of those flavored creamers? I want to know, because it changes everything I'm about to tell you, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why. And here's a preview of what's coming, because I don't want you to miss it. Item number 2 on this list today is something almost no doctor mentions to their senior patients, and it has to do with a very specific window of time after your first sip of coffee where your body is either storing sugar as fuel or storing it as fat, and which one happens depends on something most people have never even heard of. I'll explain it in full when we get there, but keep that in the back of your mind, because it might be the single biggest lever you can pull. I'm a physician, and I've spent the better part of my career working with patients in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who are trying to hold on to their independence, their ability to drive themselves to the grocery store, to play with their grandkids on the floor, to travel without worrying about a blood sugar crash in an airport. And one of the things that frustrates me most in medicine is how much oversimplified, one size fits all advice gets handed to older adults. Cut out sugar, avoid caffeine, eat less. That advice might work for a 35-year-old. It often fails an aging body because your body at 70 is not processing glucose the same way it did at 40. After the age of 70, the body's ability to respond efficiently to insulin can decline by as much as 30 to 40%, a phenomenon tied to something called anabolic resistance. Think of it like a delivery truck that used to be able to drop off packages at every single house on the block on one trip. But now, because of wear and tear on the roads, it has to make multiple trips, burns more fuel, and still leaves some houses without their delivery. That's what's happening inside your muscles and liver as you age. Glucose, which is really just sugar circulating in your blood, is the package. Insulin is the truck driver. And as we age, the truck driver has a harder and harder time getting those packages delivered into the muscle cells where they can be burned safely as energy instead of stacking up in the bloodstream where they cause damage. This is exactly why coffee, of all things, has become one of the more interesting tools researchers have studied for people over 60. It's not a miracle cure. It's not a replacement for medication. If you're on medication, please don't stop anything your doctor has prescribed based on a video. But used strategically, coffee interacts with several of the exact systems that break down as we age: inflammation, mitochondrial energy production, and the hormone signaling that tells your liver whether to release sugar or hold on to it. So today, I'm counting down 5 specific ways seniors should be drinking their coffee, ranked from good to absolutely game-changing, to help protect against diabetes and to help control blood sugar that's already elevated. Let's start at number 5. Number 5, stop drinking your coffee on an empty stomach first thing in the morning. I know for most of you, that first cup before breakfast is sacred. It's ritual. But here's what's happening physiologically. When you wake up, your body is already naturally releasing cortisol, a stress hormone that peaks in the first hour after waking as part of what's called the cortisol awakening response. Cortisol's job, among other things, is to raise blood sugar to give you energy to start your day. Now add caffeine on top of that on an empty stomach, and in some older adults, particularly those with insulin resistance, you get an amplified blood sugar spike because caffeine can stimulate the release of even more glucose from the liver at a moment when cortisol is already doing the same thing. Research out of the University of Bath found that drinking coffee before breakfast, particularly after a night of poor sleep, impaired blood sugar control in the hours that followed by around 50% compared to drinking coffee after eating. 50% is enormous when you're talking about glucose control. For an aging body, where your pancreas may already be a little slower to respond, think of the pancreas like a fire department that used to have 3 trucks ready to go and now only has 1 truck that's a bit older and slower to start. That spike matters more than it would have when you were 35. The fix is simple. Wait until you've had at least a small amount of protein or fiber in your stomach, a boiled egg, a handful of nuts, even a slice of whole grain toast with peanut butter before that first cup touches your lips. Aim for coffee no earlier than 30 to 60 minutes after you wake, and always after some food. For synergy, pair this first cup with a source of protein rather than a carbohydrate heavy breakfast, because protein slows gastric emptying and blunts the glucose response even further, essentially giving your liver and pancreas a gentler wake up call instead of a sudden alarm. I think about a woman named Carol, 74 years old, from a small town outside of Des Moines, who came to see me frustrated because her fasting blood sugar readings first thing in the morning were consistently high despite eating what she considered a healthy diet. When we went through her routine, the culprit was clear. She was drinking 2 cups of black coffee before she ate a single bite, sometimes not eating until nearly 10 in the morning. We simply shifted her coffee to after a small protein based breakfast, and within about 6 weeks, her fasting glucose readings had dropped by nearly 15 points. Nothing else changed, just the order and the timing. Number 4, stop loading your coffee with the sugary creamers and flavored syrups that have quietly become the norm at coffee shops and even in a lot of kitchens. This one might feel obvious, but I want to explain the mechanism because understanding why something matters is what makes people actually stick with a change, especially for those of you managing this for the long haul. A single tablespoon of a flavored coffee creamer can contain anywhere from 5 to 7 grams of added sugar. And if you're someone who takes 2 or 3 tablespoons plus a flavored syrup pump or 2 at a coffee shop, you can easily be consuming 25 to 35 grams of sugar in a single cup. That's more sugar than a chocolate chip cookie. For a younger body, that might be metabolized without much drama. But remember our delivery truck analogy. An aging body's insulin response, that truck driver, is already struggling to keep up with normal deliveries. Adding a flood of extra sugar on top of the caffeine is like calling in 20 extra packages during rush hour to a driver who's already behind schedule. Research consistently shows that habitual consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages, including sweetened coffee drinks, is associated with a substantially higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, with some population studies putting the increased risk above 20% for those consuming 1 or more sugary drinks daily. The fix here isn't necessarily to drink it completely black if you don't enjoy that. Very few of my senior patients want to hear just drink it black, and I'm not going to pretend that's realistic for everyone. Instead, use unsweetened almond milk, a splash of half and half, or a small amount of cinnamon, which brings its own modest blood sugar supporting properties by improving how cells respond to insulin. If you truly need sweetness, a small amount of stevia or monk fruit sweetener won't spike blood glucose the way table sugar or flavored syrups will. For synergy, cinnamon paired with coffee is particularly effective because some research suggests cinnamon may improve insulin sensitivity, meaning your truck driver gets a little more efficient at his job, working alongside the metabolic benefits already present in the coffee itself. Now, before we get to the top 3, and trust me, they get more interesting from here, I want to ask you for a small favor. If you've made it this far, it tells me you actually care about protecting your independence as you age, and that matters to me. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and give this video a like. It genuinely helps this information reach other seniors who need to hear it because the algorithm shows these videos to more people when it sees engagement. It costs you nothing and it helps somebody else's mother, father, or grandparent see this too. All right, let's get into number 3. Number 3, pay attention to the timing of your coffee relative to your meals, not just relative to waking up. This is a nuance almost nobody talks about. There's a difference between drinking coffee with a meal versus drinking it 30 to 60 minutes after a meal. Some research has found that caffeine consumed at the same time as a carbohydrate-containing meal can actually reduce insulin sensitivity in that immediate window, meaning your body handles the sugar from that specific meal slightly less efficiently than if you'd eaten without caffeine present. One controlled study found that caffeine ingested alongside a meal reduced insulin sensitivity by around 30% during the hours immediately following that meal compared to a caffeine-free control. That sounds concerning, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than sugarcoating it, because you deserve the real picture. But here's the important context. This is a short-term, meal-specific effect, not a long-term risk, And it's precisely why the massive long term studies I mentioned at the start still show coffee drinkers with a lower overall diabetes risk. The two things aren't contradictory once you understand the timing. For aging bodies specifically, where post meal blood sugar spikes are already harder to clear due to slower insulin response, this small additional effect can matter more than it would for someone younger with a more resilient pancreas. So, the practical takeaway is this: if you're having your largest, most carbohydrate heavy meal of the day, try having your coffee about an hour before or a full hour after that meal rather than sipping it throughout. If you want coffee with a meal, pair it with a lower carbohydrate meal, like eggs and vegetables, rather than a stack of pancakes or a bowl of cereal. For synergy, walking for even 10 minutes after a carbohydrate containing meal, before or instead of that mealtime coffee, does more to clear blood sugar from the bloodstream than almost anything else available to you, because muscle contraction pulls glucose into the muscle cells without even needing insulin to knock on the door. Think of it as a side entrance that bypasses your struggling truck driver entirely. I had a patient, Robert, 68, a retired mechanic from outside Tulsa, who loved his coffee with his big Sunday breakfast: eggs, toast, hash browns, and 2 full cups of coffee with cream, all consumed together over the course of an hour. His post meal glucose readings were consistently the worst of his week. We didn't ask him to give up his Sunday breakfast. We simply asked him to drink his coffee an hour before he sat down to eat and to take a short walk after the meal instead. His post meal spike came down noticeably within a month, and he still gets his Sunday breakfast exactly the way he loves it. Now let's talk about number two, the one I teased at the beginning, because this is the piece almost nobody explains properly. It has to do with something called chlorogenic acid and a window of time that most people are completely unaware of. Coffee beans, particularly when they're less roasted, contain high concentrations of chlorogenic acid, a natural plant compound that has been shown in research to slow the absorption of glucose in the intestine and to improve how the liver manages sugar storage. Here's the part that surprises people. The darker and more processed your coffee, especially instant coffee that's been heavily roasted at high heat for a long time, or heavily processed decaf that's gone through aggressive chemical extraction, or the more chlorogenic acid is destroyed in that process. Some research estimates that dark roasting can reduce chlorogenic acid content by as much as 50 to 70% compared to lighter roasts. That means the exact compound most responsible for coffee's blood sugar friendly reputation can be dramatically depleted depending on how your coffee was processed before it ever reached your cup. For an aging body, where the liver's ability to regulate glucose release, a process called gluconeogenesis, becomes less precise over time, imagine a thermostat that used to hold your house at a perfect 72 degrees, but now swings between 68 and 78 because the internal sensor has worn down. That extra help from chlorogenic acid matters more, not less, than it did when you were younger, and your internal thermostat was more finely tuned. So the practical advice here is to choose a light or medium roast rather than a dark roast whenever you can, and to lean toward real brewed coffee, whether drip, pour over, or French press, over instant coffee, which tends to have gone through more aggressive processing. If you already prefer dark roast for the taste, you're not doing something harmful, you're simply getting a smaller dose of this particular benefit, and everything else in this video still applies to you. For synergy, chlorogenic acid appears to work even better when your gut has a healthy population of fiber-fermenting bacteria, so pairing your light roast coffee with a fiber-rich diet, vegetables, beans, oats, helps your gut bacteria make the most of what the coffee is providing. And now, number one, the most powerful factor of all, more important than roast level, more important than timing, more important than what you put in it. Number one is consistency and moderate volume over years, not weeks. This is the piece that gets lost because it isn't flashy, but it's the single strongest signal in every large study on this topic. The protective association between coffee and lower diabetes risk isn't something that shows up after one good week of drinking your coffee the right way. It shows up in people who maintain a steady pattern of roughly 3 to 5 cups a day, consistently over years and decades. The research following over 1 million participants across multiple continents found that this dose-response relationship was gradual and cumulative. Each additional cup, up to about 5 or 6 per day, was associated with a further reduction in diabetes risk, with some analyses showing risk reductions of 6 to 7% for every single cup consumed daily as part of a long-term habit. This matters enormously for aging bodies because type 2 diabetes doesn't develop overnight. It develops over years of slowly accumulating insulin resistance and low-grade inflammation, sometimes called inflammaging. A persistent low-level inflammatory state that becomes more common after age 60 and that quietly damages the very cells responsible for producing and responding to insulin. Coffee contains a range of antioxidant compounds, including polyphenols, that have been shown to reduce markers of this chronic inflammation over time. Think of chronic inflammation like a slow leak in a tire. It's not a blowout, it's not dramatic, but if you don't address it consistently over months and years, it eventually flattens the whole system. A steady, moderate coffee habit appears to act like someone regularly checking that tire pressure and topping it off before it becomes a real problem, rather than only addressing it once the tire's already flat. The practical guidance is to settle into a sustainable routine of 3 to 4 cups a day, spread across the morning and early afternoon rather than clustered all at once, and avoiding coffee within about 6 hours of bedtime, since caffeine's half life in older adults can actually be longer than in younger adults, meaning it stays in your system longer and can disrupt the deep sleep your body needs to regulate blood sugar overnight. For synergy, pair your consistent coffee habit with consistent sleep and consistent light activity, because those three things, steady caffeine intake, steady sleep, and steady movement, reinforce each other far more powerfully together than any single one does alone. I think of a man named Walter, 81 years old, from a small farming community in central Illinois, who told me he'd given up coffee entirely 8 years earlier because a doctor once told him in passing that it was bad for his blood sugar. When we looked at his full picture together, we reintroduced a modest, consistent coffee habit, 3 cups a day, light roast, black with a small amount of cinnamon, spaced through the morning and taken after meals rather than before. A year later, his A1C, which is a blood test reflecting your average blood sugar over roughly the past 3 months, had improved meaningfully alongside the other changes we made together to his diet and activity. He told me it was one of the simplest changes he'd made in years, and it gave him back something he genuinely missed, that quiet morning ritual he'd been denying himself for the better part of a decade, based on advice that was never quite right for his situation. Here's what I want you to walk away with. Getting older doesn't mean your body is working against you, and it doesn't mean you have to give up the small rituals that bring you comfort and joy. It means your body needs a little more precision, a little more understanding of how it actually works now, rather than how it worked 30 years ago. Independence in your 60s, 70s, and 80s isn't just about avoiding a diagnosis on paper. It's about being able to get down on the floor and back up again to play with a grandchild. It's about driving yourself to see your friends without worrying about your blood sugar crashing on the way home. It's about waking up every morning, making that cup of coffee exactly the way you love it, and knowing that this small ritual is actually working with your body instead of against it. And here's the thing I want you to remember more than anything else in this video. It is never too late to make a change like this. Not at 65, not at 75, not at 85. The body is remarkably capable of responding to small, consistent, intelligent adjustments, no matter how many years you've been doing things a different way. All of the research I mentioned today is cited in the description below this video, so you can look at the original studies yourself and bring them to your own doctor to discuss what makes sense for your specific health situation, because everybody's situation is different. And this video isn't a substitute for the personalized care of your own physician. If this video helped you see your morning coffee in a new light, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And down in the comments, I want to know, which one of these 5 changes are you going to try first? I read every single comment, and I'll see you in the next video.